He was Austria's golden redemption story. A man who went from murderer to celebrated poet, a television personality rubbing shoulders with journalists and celebrities, a charming face on magazine covers, praised as the symbol of rehabilitation. Society saw him as proof that no matter how dark your past, you could change, reform, and even inspire others. But behind that polished smile, hidden behind applause and glowing headlines, was a chilling reality. Jack Unterweger was killing again. Imagine this. A man who had once strangled a woman with her own bra was set free after serving just 15 years of a life sentence. He convinced judges, politicians, and intellectuals that he had transformed. They hailed him as a genius writer, a man reborn through art. And yet, while Austria celebrated their reformed convict-turned-star, women began disappearing across Europe. Prostitutes, often found strung-lad with their own underwear, the exact same method Jack had used before. It's a story so unbelievable, it feels like fiction, but it isn't. Unterweger managed to fool an entire nation twice. First as a writer who claimed he had conquered his demons, and then as a murderer hiding in plain sight, even reporting on his own crimes. He wasn't just blending in, he was becoming a cultural icon, using his fame to walk right past suspicion while leaving bodies behind him. What makes his story even darker is the irony of it all. He wrote passionately about crime, about violence against women, about justice, while committing the very acts he condemned in his essays. He was hailed in universities, invited to literary circles, treated as a man who had proven that prison could create not just a better citizen, but a genius. But all along, he was treating life like a stage, performing for society, while his true performance, the killings, played out in the shadows. And the question is, how did this happen? How did a murderer not only gain early release, but rise to fame as a national celebrity? How did he trick police, journalists, even criminologists, while continuing to kill? The truth is, Jack Unterweger wasn't just a killer, he was a master manipulator. He understood how to play people's emotions, how to tell a story that made him look reformed, how to pose as a man of culture while secretly hunting vulnerable women. This story is not just about murder. It's about deception on a scale that defies belief. It's about how society's need for redemption, its hunger for second chances, blinded everyone to the dangers standing right in front of them. And at the heart of it all, it's about a man who weaponized words, who used poetry and prose not to heal, but to mask his true self. If you think monsters hide in the shadows, waiting to be discovered, you're wrong. Sometimes they're in the spotlight. Sometimes they're the ones we cheer for, the ones we put on stage, the ones we let back into our homes. Jack Unterweger is proof that evil can wear a charming smile and still win the applause of thousands. And as you watch his story unfold, remember to tease every laugh he shared, every poem he wrote, every television appearance he made was happening at the same time women were dying. That's what makes him one of the most chilling figures in true crime history. If you think monsters can't hide behind charm and fame, this story will change your mind. Subscribe now, because what you're about to hear isn't just disturbing, it's almost unbelievable. This is the story of Jack Unterweger, the poet killer. When Jack Unterweger walked out of prison in 1990, the world didn't see a murderer walking free. They saw a cultural phenomenon. He was no longer the dangerous young man who had strangled a woman with her own bra back in 1974. No. Now he was presented as a man transformed through the power of art and literature. The media celebrated him as Austria's great redemption story, the killer turned poet, the criminal turned intellectual. Publishers released his autobiographical novel, critics praised his plays, and schools began discussing his work as though he was a philosopher who had wrestled with darkness and emerged enlightened. Journalists lined up for interviews. Politicians used his case as proof that rehabilitation worked, that prisons could produce not just decent citizens, but geniuses. Jack didn't just accept this new role, he played it perfectly. He dressed sharply, spoke eloquently, charmed audiences with a combination of humility and wit. But what made his success especially dangerous was the way he stepped into the spotlight of crime reporting itself. Imagine the irony. A convicted murderer who had once killed a sex worker was now reporting on the world of prostitution for television and magazines. He strolled down red light districts with a camera crew, interviewing police officers, and asking probing questions about the dangers sex workers faced. His tone, concerned. His eyes, convincing. The public thought he was bringing attention to society's most vulnerable women. In reality, he was studying his prey, hiding his predator's instincts behind a journalist's notebook. This was the mask of Jack Unterweger, a man who turned his own infamy into fame, who manipulated not just individuals but entire institutions into believing he was a symbol of change. To the average Austrian, Jack was no longer a threat. He was a celebrity. He appeared in magazines alongside actors, mingled with the cultural elite, and was even invited onto stages to speak about rehabilitation. Teachers quoted him. Politicians praised him, and all the while, Jack was playing both roles: the reformed intellectual by day, and something much darker by night. Think about how unsettling that is. The very people who should have been most suspicious, the police, the press, the justice system, were blindfolded by his mask. Every interview he gave, every camera he faced, every applause he received reinforced his cover. And the most chilling detail, he wasn't just reporting about sex workers to raise awareness. He was writing about the very same crimes he was committing. When women began turning up dead, strangled in the same brutal way as his first victim, Unterweger was there to report the story, to shape the narrative, to control how it was told. That's the level of manipulation Jack had mastered. He wasn't just hiding, he was performing. He knew how to say exactly what society wanted to hear. He knew how to charm intellectuals, how to soften his image, how to wrap evil in sophistication. And in doing so, he became untouchable. The press called him a reformed poet. The public called him a success story. But his victims would never have the chance to call him anything at all. Jack Unterweger didn't just wear a mask, he built a career from it. And it worked. While Austria applauded its rehabilitated poet, women were vanishing one by one. The nation's darling was, once again, a predator on the hunt. To understand how Jack Unterweger became the man who fooled a nation, we have to step back into his beginnings, into a childhood steeped in abandonment, violence, and humiliation. Because long before the magazine covers, the television appearances, and the standing ovations, there was a boy born into poverty and shame. Jack Unterweger entered the world in 1950, in Judenburg, Austria. His father was an American soldier, gone before Jack even opened his eyes. His mother was a sex worker, a fact that weighed heavily on Jack's identity. Arrested repeatedly, she was absent for much of his early years. With no stable home, Jack was left in the care of his grandfather, a man described as violent, a drunk who set an example of cruelty rather than compassion. This was Jack's first role model, a man who solved problems with fists and rage. From the start, Jack's life was chaotic. He grew up unwanted, bouncing between unstable caretakers, absorbing the stigma of being the son of a prostitute. Other children mocked him. Teachers described him as restless, volatile, prone to lashing out. By his teenage years, he was already in trouble with the law, petty theft, assaults, escalating aggression. Jack was learning that the world was a place of domination. You hurt before you are hurt. And beneath it all, a seed of hatred was growing. Hatred toward his mother, who abandoned him. Hatred toward women who reminded him of her. Hatred toward the society that branded him a bastard child. That bitterness would eventually become his signature motive, targeting women who mirrored the figure that haunted him since birth. By his late teens, Jack was spiraling. He drifted through Europe, living on the margins, turning to sex work himself at times, running scams, getting into fights. He was a young man with no direction, no stability, no guidance except the lessons of violence and control learned from his grandfather. It was during these years that he began to show disturbing signs of sadism. He bragged about fights, about dominating others, about taking what he wanted. His anger, his sense of rejection, and his obsession with women's sexuality were sharpening into something dangerous. It wasn't long before crime became his constant companion. Police files started stacking up. Theft, assault, pimping, intimidation. Each arrest ended with release. Each release was followed by new crimes. Authorities described him as a lost cause, He was barely in his 20s and already labeled as incorrigible. But beneath the official records, something darker was brewing. This wasn't just about money or survival anymore, this was about control. Jack was beginning to act out fantasies rooted in his hatred of women. Fantasies that would soon escalate beyond robbery and assault. Looking back, criminologists point to this period as the perfect storm. A neglected child, raised in abuse, mocked by society, who transformed his pain into rage and his rage into cruelty. Instead of seeking redemption, Jack found power in domination. Instead of healing, he fed on humiliation, both his own and the kind he could inflict on others. By the early 1970s, the trajectory was clear. Jack Unterweger wasn't just a troubled young man anymore. He was becoming something far more dangerous. He was learning how to stalk, how to manipulate, how to silence his victims. And it was only a matter of time before his escalating violence would claim its first life. The child of violence was about to become a man of murder. By the mid-1970s, Jack Unterweger was no longer just a petty criminal drifting on the margins of society. He was a man simmering with rage, carrying years of resentment toward women, rejection from society, and the violent lessons of his grandfather. And in 1974, all of that darkness finally erupted into murder. Her name was Margaret Schaefer, an 18-year-old girl walking alone near the woods in Salzburg. She was young, full of life, a girl who could have been anyone's daughter or sister. Jack lured her in, as he would so many others later, using charm mixed with menace. But once she was in his grasp, there was no escape. He strangled her using her own braha, cruel, intimate method of control that would become his signature. For Jack, this wasn't just about killing. It was about humiliation, domination, and the reenactment of his twisted relationship with women. The murder shocked Austria. A young woman brutally strangled, her body abandoned, her future stolen. But investigators moved quickly. Jack wasn't a clever killer yet. He was reckless, sloppy, leaving trails of suspicion that led straight back to him. Within weeks, police arrested him. This time, there was no escape, no loophole. He was sentenced to life in prison. At just 24 years old, Jack Unterweger had gone from troubled drifter to convicted murderer. Society expected him to disappear behind bars forever, but prison didn't crush Jack. It transformed him. He found something behind those walls that would become his deadliest weapon, not a knife, not a gun, but words. Jack began to write. At first, it was simple. Poems, short stories, autobiographical fragments. But soon, he turned these scribbles into full manuscripts. He wrote about his childhood, his suffering, his supposed regret. And to the surprise of many, his words struck a chord. His writing wasn't amateur, it was haunting, lyrical, almost hypnotic. Publishers took notice. Critics praised him as a raw, authentic voice of pain and redemption. Newspapers began to run stories about the killer poet, the man who found salvation through literature. Intellectuals visited him in prison, curious about this rough criminal who spoke with the sensitivity of an artist. Teachers even assigned his work to students, and slowly, Jack began to recast himself, not as a monster, but as a tragic figure who had overcome his past through art. It was manipulation at its finest. Behind bars, Jack wasn't rehabilitating. He was rehearsing. He was practicing the mask he would one day wear in public. He learned how to play two people's emotions, how to spin his suffering into a redemption story, how to make himself look less like a predator and more like a misunderstood soul. The more he wrote, the more society believed in him. His plays were staged, his books published, his voice amplified, and every word he wrote was another step toward freedom. Jack knew what he was doing. He wasn't just expressing himself, he was building a brand. The poet-killer became a cause for artists, activists, and politicians who believed prison could rehabilitate anyone. They lobbied for his release, pointing to his art as proof of transformation. And the terrifying thing, it worked. After serving only 15 years of his life sentence, Jack Unterweger was granted parole. The same man who strung-led a teenager with her own bra was about to walk free, not as a criminal but as a celebrity. The stage was set. Jack had rewritten his own story. Society thought it had created a miracle of rehabilitation, but in truth, it had unleashed a wolf dressed in the clothing of a poet, and his next act would be deadlier than anyone could imagine. In 1990, after just 15 years behind bars, Jack Unterweger walked out of prison. But this wasn't a quiet release, the kind you'd expect for a convicted murderer. No, this was a media event, a cultural victory lap. Austria didn't just let him go, they celebrated him. Newspapers ran triumphant headlines, praising the justice system for giving a man a second chance. Politicians pointed to his story as proof that rehabilitation was possible. And Jack, he embraced the role completely. He was no longer the poor, violent drifter of his youth. He was now Jack the writer, the reformed intellectual who had conquered his demons with art. He wore sharp suits, smoked expensive cigars, and charmed journalists with his eloquence. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was stepping onto stages, shaking hands with celebrities, mingling with academics. To the public, he was a miracle living proof that a man could kill, repent, and return as a voice of culture. The media couldn't get enough of him. Television producers invited him onto talk shows. Literary circles treated him as a star. His books sold, his plays drew crowds, and he began appearing in glossy magazines. His face alongside famous actors and politicians. He gave speeches about rehabilitation, about overcoming a violent past, about the importance of art and healing. The irony was suffocating. This man, who had once strangled a young woman, was now a poster child for compassion and second chances. But Jack didn't stop there. He took his role to the next level. He became a journalist, specifically a crime reporter. Imagine the audacity. A convicted murderer writing about unsolved murders. He visited red light districts with a camera crew, interviewing sex workers about the dangers they faced. He questioned police about why more wasn't being done to protect vulnerable women. He presented himself as a crusader for justice, a man uniquely qualified to speak about violence because he had lived it. To the public, he was fearless, empathetic, even heroic. But beneath the polished mask, nothing had changed. The man who strangled women in 1974 hadn't disappeared. He had only become smarter, more patient, more calculating. He understood how to move unnoticed now, because no one suspected him anymore. After all, who would look at the charming poet, the cultural darling, the man shaking hands with police chiefs and think, killer? Not long after his release, women began to vanish again. Sex workers, often alone at night, last seen stepping into cars. Their bodies would later be discovered, strangled with their own brasta. Exact same method Jack had used before prison, but instead of suspicion falling on him, he used his role as a journalist to place himself right at the center of the investigation. He wrote about the killings with apparent concern, appearing on television to discuss the dangers sex workers faced. The killer was hiding in plain sight, reporting on his own crimes. This was the perfected mask of Jack Unterweger, a reformed man on the surface, adored by the public, trusted by the police, admired by intellectuals, but underneath, he was the same predator, only now. He was more dangerous than ever. He had learned how to manipulate not just individuals, but entire institutions. He wasn't just living a double life, he was thriving in it. Austria thought they had created a symbol of hope. In reality, they had unleashed a nightmare. Jack Unterweger had fooled them all, and while they celebrated his redemption, women were dying in silence. For a brief moment after his release, it seemed as though Jack Unterweger was living the dream society had scripted for him. He was a writer, a television personality, a celebrated voice on crime and justice. But it didn't take long before his old urges resurfaced, urges that had been waiting, festering, hidden beneath the polished smile of Austria's reformed man. It started subtly. In Vienna, sex workers began to disappear. One by one, women who worked the streets vanished without explanation, their absence at first brushed off as the dangers of their profession. But then, bodies began to surface. The cause of death was unmistakable strangulation, and in a chilling echo of Unterweger's first murder, the killer was using the women's own brass as the murder weapon. For the police, it was evidence of a predator repeating a ritual. For Jack, it was his signature returning with full force. The public, however, saw nothing suspicious. How could the nation's most celebrated ex-convict, the symbol of rehabilitation, possibly be involved? After all, He was reporting on the very murders he was committing. Jack wasn't hiding in the shadows this time. He was sitting in newsrooms, standing on street corners with a microphone, presenting himself as a crusader for women's safety. In his articles and TV segments, he spoke with apparent concern about the killings. He asked hard questions of the police. Why aren't these crimes being solved? Why aren't sex workers being protected? But while he played the role of journalist, his double life grew darker. He began traveling. Murders began appearing not only in Austria, but in neighboring Germany, and eventually across the Atlantic in the United States. In Los Angeles, at least 3 sex workers were found strangled in the exact same way. During the same period, Jack happened to be visiting the city on assignment. He had been invited by Austrian media to cover American policing, and instead, he left a trail of corpses in Hollywood's bag. This was no longer a coincidence. The killings carried his unmistakable signature. The same weapon, the same ritual, the same victim profile. Vulnerable women on the margins of society. Women society ignored. Women who would not be missed by anyone powerful enough to raise alarm. For Jack, they were the perfect targets. For investigators, it was the mark of a serial killer. What makes this phase of his crime so terrifying is how effortlessly he moved between his 2 lives. By day, he wore suits, attended parties, and dined with journalists who admired his intellect. By night, he stalked women, offering rides in his car, luring them in with charm before unleashing violence. He lived like 2 people at once, the respected author and the monster who killed with his bare hands. And the scariest part, he seemed to enjoy the irony. While victims were discovered in Vienna, Jack appeared on television, shaking his head, speaking about the tragedy of violence against women. While Los Angeles police investigated strangulations, Jack was in town as a foreign correspondent, taking notes as though he were writing about someone else's crimes. It was as if he delighted in the game mocking the world by committing murders in plain sight, confident that his mask would protect him. As the bodies piled up, suspicions slowly began to grow. Investigators started noticing the chilling pattern. The same MO, the same timeline, the same convenient overlaps with Jack's travels. For the first time since his release, cracks began to form in the image he had so carefully built. The poet, the intellectual, the media darling suddenly. Whispers began to circulate. Could Austria's redemption story still be the monster they thought they had locked away? The answer was already written in the corpses left behind. Jack Unterweger wasn't reformed. A was reborn smarter, more manipulative, and more dangerous than ever before. And soon, the mask he wore so well would begin to crumble. What kind of man strangles women with their own brass, then turns around and writes heartfelt poetry that moves an entire nation? To understand Jack Unterweger, you have to dive into the twisted psychology that fueled him. Because Jack wasn't just a killer, was a narcissist who turned his entire life into a performance. At the core of his rage was women, more specifically, sex workers. His hatred of them wasn't random, it was deeply personal. Jack was born to a sex worker mother who abandoned him as a child. He grew up neglected, abused by a cruel grandfather, and surrounded by instability. In his mind, his mother's choices had poisoned his childhood. That resentment grew into a lifelong obsession. Every woman who sold her body became a target in his twisted logic, a stand-in for the mother he despised but could never confront. Killing them wasn't just violence, was his way of reclaiming control over a pain that haunted him since birth. But here's the terrifying part. Jack didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as an artist. To him, murder wasn't just an act of cruelty, it was a performance, an expression of power. Strangling a woman, then writing poetry about loneliness, fame, or redemption, these weren't contradictions in his mind. They were part of the same play. He lived for irony, for the thrill of being admired as a reformed man while committing the very crimes he was supposed to have left behind. Criminologists who studied him later described him as a textbook case of narcissistic psychopathy. He was charming, articulate, and intelligent, but utterly devoid of empathy. To Jack, people weren't people, they were props in his grand narrative. Victims were tools for his violence. Journalists, politicians, even prison reform advocates, they were his audience. He thrived on manipulation, and the bigger the stage, the more satisfaction he drew from fooling everyone. Think about it. When he committed his first murder in 1974, he strangled a woman with her own bra. 16 years later, after fame in prison, after rehabilitation and applause, he returned to the exact same method. Why? Because it was symbolic. It was ritualistic. It was his signature, the knot in the rope of his identity. By using the same method, he was sending a message to himself. I'm still in control. I can still do this. They'll never catch me. And then there was the thrill of irony. Imagine being a crime journalist, reporting on unsolved murders, while secretly knowing you were a killer. He interviewed sex workers for TV, warning them about the dangers of predators, when he himself was the predator. He wrote articles questioning why police couldn't stop the killings, while laughing to himself that he was the one committing them. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a game. The more public he was, the safer he felt. Who would dare suspect the celebrated poet, the reformed man, the journalist? Jack Unterweger didn't just kill for the act itself. He killed for the narrative. He wanted to be seen as untouchable, as someone who could live two lives without consequence. In a way, he was addicted not just to murder, but to the applause, the headlines, the whispers of admiration. He wanted to control not only his victims, but society's perception of him. And for years, he succeeded. But as with every narcissist, cracks began to show. The more confident he became, the sloppier he grew. The trail of bodies was too consistent, too obvious. And soon, investigators began connecting the dots. The irony that had once protected him being both killer and journalist was about to backfire spectacularly. Because the story Jack Unterweger had been writing for himself was about to turn into a manhunt. For years, Jack Unterweger basked in the glow of fame. He was the darling of Austrian media, the living proof that prison reform worked. A man who had turned from killer to poet, from convict to cultural icon. But while the world applauded, detectives were quietly growing uneasy, because in the shadows of Jack's success, women kept disappearing, and all of them fit the same haunting pattern. In Vienna, sex workers were vanishing at an alarming rate. Police reports described women last seen entering cars never to be found alive. Then, bodies began to surface, each one strangled with their own bra. The detail was chilling, and to the few who remembered his past, it was unmistakable. This was the exact method Jack had used in his first murder, back in 1974. At first, suspicion was unthinkable. Jack was a TV personality. He was interviewing police officers on camera, writing columns in magazines, giving lectures on crime. He even went on television to discuss the very murders he was committing. Imagine the audacity. He would sit across from investigators and speculate about the killeress. Motives when he himself had just dumped a body hours earlier. It was the ultimate performance, and for a while, everyone believed it. But evidence doesn't care about charm, and slowly, patterns began to emerge. In Austria, Germany, and even Czechoslovakia, sex workers were being killed in identical ways. Then came the boldest move of all. In 1991, Jack traveled to the United States, supposedly on a journalistic assignment. His task? To cover American crime and sex work for Austrian media. But soon after his arrival in Los Angeles, 3 women were murdered strangled, with their own brass. That was the breaking point. The odds of coincidence were gone. Police on both continents began to whisper the unthinkable. Could the celebrated poet be the serial killer they were hunting? International law enforcement started comparing notes, linking his travels to murder scenes. And as the puzzle came together, the glamorous facade of Jack Unterweger began to collapse. By 1992, suspicion turned into certainty. Arrest warrants were issued. Detectives closed in, ready to bring down the man who had fooled Austria's intellectual elite, charmed politicians, and danced in the spotlight while leaving a trail of corpses. But Jack wasn't about to face justice. So Azali, when he realized investigators were closing in, he did what narcissists always do. He ran. Taking his girlfriend with him, Jack fled across Europe, hopping between hotels and safe houses. Every day was a new disguise, a new story, but everywhere he went, headlines followed. Poet turned killer. Serial murderer on the run. The irony was unbearable. Jack Unterweger, once celebrated for reporting crime, had now become the crime story himself. The chase went international. Austrian police coordinated with Interpol. The FBI tracked his movements in the United States. Airports were monitored, hotels were raided, and Europe buzzed with updates on the most glamorous fugitive it had ever seen. And through it all, Jack seemed almost pleased. To him, this wasn't just a manhunt, it was his greatest performance yet. He was the star of a global story, his face plastered on front pages, his name whispered in fear and fascination. But no matter how clever or charming, no man can outrun the truth forever. And as Jack's trail grew thinner, the authorities finally caught up. The poet killer's stage was about to turn into a prison cell once again. Only this time the applause would be replaced with the clang of handcuffs. By 1992, the curtain had finally begun to fall on Jack Unterweger's deadly performance. 4 months, he had been on the run, slipping between borders, hiding in hotels, fleeing from one country to the next with his girlfriend at his side. But no fugitive, no matter how clever, can stay ahead of the law forever. The poet-turned-killer was about to meet his final audience. The chase ended in Miami, Florida. After weeks of tracking him across Europe and into the United States, authorities cornered Jack. He was living under false names, moving like a shadow. But the FBI and Austrian police were waiting. When they arrested him, Jack didn't put up a fight. He didn't scream or resist. Instead, he carried himself with the same calm arrogance that had carried him through his double life. To the very end, he acted like a man in control of the story. Extradited back to Austria, Jack's trial quickly became a media circus. The world wanted to see the poet who fooled intellectuals, seduced celebrities, and conned the justice system, now unmasked as a predator. Courtrooms overflowed with journalists, criminologists, and ordinary citizens desperate to witness the unraveling of Austria's greatest rehabilitation story. The prosecution laid out the evidence with devastating precision. The murders in Austria, Germany, Czechoslovakia, and even Los Angeles all bore the same chilling signature. Women strangled with their own brass, the knot tied in Jack's unmistakable fashion. Witness testimonies placed him near crime scenes. Forensic experts matched fibers, hairs, and time. His travels matched perfectly with the murders. What once looked like coincidence now formed a perfect, damning pattern. But Jack, ever the performer, refused to accept defeat. In court, he smiled. He waved at the press. He maintained his innocence with the confidence of a man who believed his charm could still win. He gave long, dramatic speeches, weaving words like the poet he was. At times, it felt less like a trial and more like theater with Jack as the lead actor. He wanted to be remembered not as a killer, but as a tragic hero misunderstood by the world. Yet the evidence was overwhelming. Witness after witness, victim after victim, piece after piece of forensic proof painted the same picture. Jack Unterweger, the reformed man, had never changed at all. He had manipulated Austria into freeing him, then immediately resumed killing with the exact same brutality. He was not a symbol of prison reform. He was a cautionary tale of how monsters can wear masks. In June 1994, the verdict came. Jack Unterweger was found guilty of 9 murders. The jury didn't hesitate. Life imprisonment without parole. For a man who had built his life on control, manipulation, and narrative. The judgment was devastating. This time, there would be no second act, no applause, no carefully crafted comeback story. His mask had been shattered, and the truth of who he really was stood exposed before the world. But Jack Unterweger wasn't finished yet. Even in the moment of his downfall, he plotted his final act, one last performance to ensure he had the final word. Because only hours after his sentencing, Jack Unterweger would make sure the story didn't end in prison bars but in a chilling twist that mirrored his own crimes. The verdict was in: guilty on 9 counts of murder. The sentence: life without parole. For most, that would be the end. A notorious killer locked away. Justice finally served, but Jack Unterweger had never been like most men. He was an actor, a manipulator, a man obsessed with controlling every detail of his story, and he wasn't about to let the world write the ending for him. Just hours after his conviction in 1994, as the courtrooms emptied and the cameras shut down, Jack prepared his final act. Guards found him dead in his cell. hanging by a cord he had fashioned from shoelaces and the drawstring of his prison trousers. But here is the part that chills to the bone. He tied the knot the exact same way he had tied the brass of his victims. It was more than suicide, it was his signature. One last message, carved into the silence of a prison cell. Even in death, Jack Unterweger was performing, echoing the very crimes that made him infamous. It was as though he wanted to remind the world, I am still in control. I decide the ending, not you. But if he thought this final twist would elevate him to some kind of tragic legend, history has judged him differently. Two criminologists. Unterweger remains one of the most disturbing examples of narcissistic psychopathy. A man who tricked intellectual elites, seduced the media, and fooled an entire nation into believing he was rehabilitated. In truth, he was never reformed, only rehearsing. His story forces us to ask terrifying questions. How many other predators hide behind masks of success, fame, or respectability? How many monsters are celebrated while their crimes go unnoticed? And how much can society really trust its own ability to tell redemption from deception? Jack Unterweger's life is a chilling reminder that the scariest killers aren't always the ones lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes they're the ones on stage, smiling, applauded, admired. Sometimes they're the ones holding the pen, writing their own myths while blood stains their hands. And in the end, Jack Unterweger wrote his final poem with a rope.